placed a mop bucket at my wife's feet while the string quartet was still playing. I had written a check for $140,000 for that afternoon. $140,000 for white camellias flown in from Georgia, for a venue that had stood since before the Civil War, for a guest list my daughter-in-law had personally curated down to the last seat assignment. I had paid for all of it, and what I received in return was watching my wife of 34 years bend slowly, carefully, her bad hip already aching, and lift that bucket off the floor, as if she had always known this was her place in the room. Her name is Ruth, and she deserved none of what happened that day. Before I go any further, if this story finds you wherever you are tonight, take 1 second and subscribe. Leave me a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I read every single one. Your presence here is the only reason I keep telling these stories slowly, honestly, the way they actually happened. Now let me take you back to the beginning of that afternoon, before I understood what kind of day it truly was. The Beaumont estate sits about 20 minutes outside Charleston, South Carolina. If you've never been to the South Carolina Lowcountry in late spring, it's the kind of place that makes everything look like a painting. Spanish moss hanging from live oaks that are 300 years old. A main hall with heart pine floors that catch the late afternoon light just so. My son Marcus had told me he wanted something timeless. His fiancée Diana had sent me a PDF with the vendor list, the floral concept, the wine pairings, the photographer's portfolio. At the bottom of that PDF was a number, $140,000. And beneath the number, 4 words, "This is the minimum. I am 69 years old. I spent 41 years as a structural engineer. I have reviewed load-bearing calculations for bridges, for hospital wings, for parking structures where one miscalculation would mean people die. I know what it means to look at a number and understand its weight. I signed that check without a single phone call back. I didn't want my son to feel the weight of it. I didn't want his wedding day colored by obligation. I understand now that was my first mistake, but I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back into that hall, to the moment I was standing near the east wall, a glass of sweet tea in my hand that I hadn't touched, watching Diana the way a structural engineer watches a wall that has just developed a hairline crack. She was speaking to Ruth in the way you speak to someone you have already decided is beneath you. Not loudly, not cruelly, not in a way anyone passing by would register as anything other than a quiet instruction. That was the precision of it. Diana had a talent for cruelty that left no fingerprints. She tilted her head slightly to the left, lowered her voice, and gestured toward the hallway that led to the estate's guest facilities. Ruth stood holding her cane, her weight shifted to her right side the way it always is when she's been on her feet too long. She had worn her good blue dress, the one she bought 3 months earlier, and had taken in twice because she kept losing weight from the stress of planning a wedding that was never quite ours to plan. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because it is important. A woman in her middle 60s, in her best blue dress, with a cane, standing in a 200-year-old plantation hall, being given a mop bucket and a pair of yellow rubber gloves. If you have ever watched someone you love be diminished and felt your entire body go absolutely still, not from shock, but from a kind of cold, crystalline clarity, then you know exactly what I felt standing against that east wall. I didn't move. I am aware that sounds strange. I want to explain it because I've thought about it many times since. In 41 years of engineering, I learned that the worst thing you can do when you spot a structural failure beginning is to react before you understand the full shape of what's happening. You stand, you measure, you let it show itself completely, because the part you can see is almost never the whole problem. So I stood, and I watched Ruth walk down that hallway. Small steps, careful steps, the steps of a woman who has spent 30 years making herself smaller to keep the peace. That was the moment I understood something I had been avoiding for a long time. I had not protected her, not today, and not for a long time before today. Now, I want to pause here for just a second, because when I've shared pieces of this story with people I trust, friends here in Charleston, a few old colleagues, the first question they always ask is, how did you keep it together? How did you stand there and not walk straight across that room? And my honest answer is this: I kept it together because Ruth would have been mortified. She would have whispered to me right there in front of everyone that I was making a scene on Marcus's big day. She would have taken the humiliation onto herself, rather than let me create a confrontation. That was the trap. Diana understood that about Ruth before I did. The guest facilities at Beaumont are beautiful. I know because I personally approved the renovation contract 18 months earlier when Diana said the existing bathrooms didn't reflect the family's standards. Italian tile, custom stone basins, mirrors so large they could reflect the whole room back at you. She had sent me the quote. I had paid it without question. It had not occurred to me at the time to ask, whose family, which standards. I found out that afternoon exactly which family she meant. A young server had given Ruth the rubber gloves and gestured to a supply closet. He couldn't look at her directly. I recognized that look. It is the look of someone who knows they are witnessing something wrong, and who has made the calculation that intervening costs more than they are willing to pay. I have worn that look myself. I'm not proud of it. I stayed where I was. I needed to see the complete picture. From the east wall, I had a sight line to Marcus, my son. He was standing near the south entrance with his champagne, wearing the suit we had chosen together, wearing the cufflinks I gave him the day he passed the bar exam. He is 36 years old. He is, by every external measure, successful. He looked toward the hallway once. Just once. I watched his face carefully. What I saw there was not anger. It was not guilt. It was the face of a man running a risk analysis. If I step in, what is the cost? What is the probability the evening recovers? He finished the calculation in about 4 seconds. Then he turned back to the elderly couple beside him and smiled. I thought about what it means to raise a child. 36 years of decisions, the school you choose, the books you leave on their shelf, the moments you step in and the moments you let them fail. I had raised a son who could calculate risk faster than almost anyone I knew. What I had failed to teach him was that some calculations should never be run. Some things you simply stand in front of, regardless of cost. That was the second crack I saw that afternoon. The music played on. Someone tapped a glass and a small ripple of laughter moved through the room. An old colleague of mine appeared at my elbow and said it was the finest wedding he'd been to in 20 years. I thanked him. I did not tell him that the standard he was admiring had been purchased at the cost of our retirement savings, or that in a back hallway at this very moment, my wife was cleaning a bathroom, so a woman who had never once called her by her first name could maintain her social image. When Ruth came back, she didn't look at anyone for a long moment. She went to the powder room near the main entrance and stayed there a while. When she came out, her hands were very clean, and the stain on the lower hem of her blue dress had been dabbed at but not entirely removed. Diana glanced at her once, just once, and then turned to adjust something on her veil. No acknowledgement, no pause. The way you mark an item on a checklist and move on. Ruth came to stand beside me. I felt the change in her breathing before she said a single word, slightly heavier than usual. More careful. She was managing herself the way she always does when she's holding something in. She said she was fine. She said we shouldn't make anything of it today. I put my hand over hers. I told her I understood. And I did understand, but perhaps not the way she intended. I understood that I had built a stage for my own wife's humiliation. I understood that every dollar I had spent on this afternoon had, in some way, funded the performance I had just watched. And I understood, standing there with her hand under mine, that if I left that hall without doing anything, my silence would become something Ruth would carry for the rest of her life. It would become permission. I want to stop for a moment and speak to you directly, because I know some of you watching this right now are parents. Some of you have written checks you couldn't afford to write. Some of you have told yourselves that giving is how you hold a family together. I believed that for a long time. I want to tell you what I learned the hard way in that hall at Beaumont Estate. Giving without limits doesn't hold a family together. It teaches certain people that there are no limits, and people who learn that lesson eventually test it. I looked around the hall one more time. Everything ran with the precision I had paid for. The camellia arrangements, the private quartet, the menu I had reviewed line by line at Diana's request. It all moved like a well-lubricated machine. But I had spent 4 decades looking at structures, and I could see the cracks that no one else was looking for. Small ones, barely visible from the outside. The kind that, if left unaddressed, bring the whole thing down eventually. The most important moment of that afternoon was already behind me. It was the moment the bucket was placed on the floor. Everything that followed was simply my response to it. I smiled when people looked at me. I raised my glass when the toasts were made. I shook hands with relatives I barely knew. No one in that room suspected that inside my mind, very quietly, a door had just closed. No announcement, no sound, just the cold, precise finality of a decision made by someone who has stopped waiting to see if things improve on their own. I did not leave the reception hall immediately. My body needed a few more minutes to accept what had just happened. Ruth sat near the window with her cane resting against the chair arm, rubbing her hip with the quiet determination she always uses when she refuses to complain. The late afternoon light came through the old wavy glass and fell across her face, and I saw every year of the 34 years we had been married written there. Those years had never made her look weak to me. Not once. But standing there watching her, I felt the particular weight of a man who understands, too late and too clearly, that he has let someone stand alone for far longer than he should have. Not just in that hallway. In this family, I remember the first time Diana came to our house on Rutledge Avenue. She walked through the front rooms looking at everything with a kind of careful attention that I mistook for curiosity. She asked about the house, whether it was paid off, what the property value was running in the neighborhood. I smiled at the time. I told myself she was a practical young woman, accustomed to thinking in numbers. That was what Marcus had always admired about her, he told me. Her clarity about value. I understand now that what I witnessed that afternoon was not curiosity. It was inventory. When Marcus told me he wanted to get married at Beaumont, I said, of course. When Diana sent the PDF with the vendor list and the number at the bottom, I signed the check. I drew from the retirement account, the one Ruth and I had built together over 4 decades, the one we had talked about quietly on winter evenings, imagining the years we would finally spend just for ourselves. I told Ruth it would be the last time. The last large thing. She nodded. She has always believed that generosity is the language family speaks to each other. She learned it from her mother, and her mother learned it from hers. I don't know how to tell her that not everyone speaks the same language. It wasn't just the wedding. 18 months before that afternoon, Marcus had called me from a conference in New York. He said there was an opportunity in the Manhattan real estate market that he and Diana had been watching. She wanted an apartment close to her office, something that would make a certain kind of impression. He said if I co-signed and let the deed sit temporarily in his name for financing purposes, it would simplify everything. I trusted him. He is my son. I told myself that trust is how you show a grown child that you still believe in them. That trust did not begin to fail me over money. It began to fail me over whispers. I had stepped out through the estate side door to get some air. My chest had been tight since Ruth came back from the bathroom, and I found myself near the rear garden where Diana was standing with her mother and a younger cousin I had never been introduced to. They were not speaking quietly. When people feel safe, they forget to lower their voices. Diana was describing the future. Her tone was cheerful, almost light. She said that with the wedding behind them, the next step was to begin moving things around. That the two of them, and here she used a phrase that I will not repeat exactly, but its meaning was clear. 2 old people from the country who had done what was needed and would now need to be relocated somewhere more convenient, somewhere quieter, somewhere out of the way. Her mother asked about the finances. Diana answered without hesitation. She said Marcus understood the situation, that he knew the smart choice was to stay quiet. I stood behind a row of crepe myrtles for a long moment after she finished speaking. The music from the main hall reached me faintly. Someone inside was laughing. Marcus understands. Those 2 words sat inside me like a weight. I thought of him standing near the south entrance with his champagne. The 4-second calculation. The smooth turn back to the elderly couple beside him. And I understood then that this was not a new arrangement. This was not Diana acting alone and Marcus unaware. This was an agreement. A long-standing, carefully maintained agreement, in which my role and Ruth's role had always been to fund and then recede. I did not walk out from behind those crepe myrtles and confront anyone. There was no point. Some truths, when exposed at the wrong moment, simply scatter. I had learned to wait for the moment when they have nowhere to go. I went back inside. I sat beside Ruth. She looked at me and asked if I was all right. I said yes. I said we would be leaving soon. She looked surprised. It was still early, but she did not press me. That is one of the things I have treasured most about Ruth for 34 years. She does not need every decision explained. She only needs to know she is not being left behind. When the event coordinator came to me to confirm the timing for the main course service, I told him I needed a few minutes. He nodded professionally and moved on. He assumed I meant I needed to use the restroom. I took my phone out of my jacket pocket and walked to a quiet alcove near the estate's library. The first call was to the event company's billing department. I spoke slowly and clearly. I confirmed the outstanding balance, and I informed them that the final transfer would not be proceeding. The manager who took the call sounded very briefly surprised, and then very carefully neutral. He asked if there was a problem with the service. I said yes. I said the problem was significant enough that the remaining portion of the evening would need to stop before the main course was served. I did not explain further. I ended the call. In 41 years of engineering, I learned that the most important decisions do not require long explanations. A decision that needs a long explanation is usually a decision you're still trying to talk yourself into. I was not talking myself into anything. The second call was to the car service that had been contracted to drive Marcus and Diana from the estate to their hotel after the reception. I read back the contract reference number and canceled it. When the coordinator mentioned the cancellation fee, I told them to send the invoice to my billing address. There are costs I am willing to absorb. My wife's dignity is not a line item I will negotiate against. I was aware, while I made these calls, of Ruth sitting in her chair by the window. I did not want her to carry the weight of what I was doing. Some decisions a husband makes alone not to exclude his wife, but because they should have been made long ago, and making them late is the only way to make them right. The third call was to the hotel in Savannah where the honeymoon suite had been booked. Ocean View, 4 nights, booked under my name, as a gift I had presented to them at the engagement dinner 9 months earlier. I asked the front desk to cancel the reservation. She was professionally warm and asked for no reason. I gave her none. Some things simply stopped being appropriate. With each call, I felt something that I want to try to describe accurately, because I think it matters. It was not satisfaction. It was not anger releasing. It was the specific feeling of closing a door that has been standing open for too long, letting cold air in, and finally reaching out and pushing it shut. Quiet, final, correct. When I put the phone back in my pocket and walked back to Ruth, she looked at my face for a long moment. She knows my face the way you learn a road you have driven for 30 years. She knew something had shifted. She placed her hand on my arm and said she hoped I hadn't done anything that would put Marcus in a difficult position. I looked at her. I said the difficulty had existed for a long time. Today was simply the day it had made itself visible. I said that some things, if not stopped, will simply continue until there is nothing left to stop them from taking. Ruth was quiet. That quiet was not disagreement. That quiet was the sound of a woman who has wanted someone to say exactly this for longer than she would ever admit out loud. Now, I want to speak to you again directly, because I know some of you watching right now have been in a version of this position. Maybe not this exact situation, but you know what it's like to feel the slow drain of a relationship where the giving only goes one direction, where you keep adjusting, keep accommodating, keep telling yourself that this is just how family works, that generosity is its own reward. I want to say something honestly to you, and I say it not as a lecture but as someone who learned it the hard way at 69 years old in a plantation hall in South Carolina. Generosity has a boundary. It has a boundary not because you stop loving someone, but because love without a boundary isn't love, it's just a resource being drawn down. If you feel yourself being drawn down right now, in your own life, in your own family, this is worth thinking about carefully. Not tomorrow, today. I thought I was finished with the phone calls. There was one more. I had retained a property attorney in Charleston for nearly 15 years. A quiet man, thorough, the kind of professional who documents everything without being asked. When Marcus and I had arranged the temporary deed transfer on the Manhattan apartment, that attorney had drafted a recovery clause at my specific request, a safeguard. At the time, I had told myself I would never use it. I told myself it was simply good documentation practice. What I understand now is that some part of me, the part trained to think in structural terms, had known even then that a load-bearing element was being moved into position that should not be trusted without a failsafe. I dialed his number. He picked up on the second ring. I did not circle the point. I told him I wanted to activate the recovery clause on the Manhattan property. I gave him the address. I told him the circumstances had changed. He was quiet for a few seconds, professional quiet, not surprised quiet. Then he confirmed the steps, referencing the language from the original document, as if reading from a blueprint we had both reviewed many times, even though we had only discussed it once. I listened and said yes. When the call ended, I leaned against the wall of the alcove for a moment. That was the first time all afternoon my body admitted it was tired, not from age, from the particular exhaustion of holding something in for far longer than it should have been held. I walked back out through the main hall. The quartet was playing something light. Trays were moving. Glasses were being refilled. Everything continued exactly as designed. Then, from behind me, I heard a change in the room's register. A subtle ripple. A server near the kitchen entrance speaking quietly to a colleague. The event manager looking toward the main doors with an expression. I recognized the expression of someone managing a problem they didn't anticipate. I guided Ruth gently outside to the parking lot. The air was cooler than the hall. Wisteria from the estate's rear fence carried on the evening breeze. I helped Ruth to the passenger seat, closed her door carefully, and then stood beside the car for a moment before getting in. The night was very still. Inside my mind, Everything was clear, clearer than it had been in months, maybe years. The cracks I had been tracking all afternoon in the bathroom hallway, behind the crepe myrtles, in my son's 4-second calculation, they had all connected now into a single, unambiguous line. I knew what was built on that line. And I knew what was going to happen next. I got in. I closed the door. I told Ruth, quietly, that things would change from here. She didn't ask what I meant. She placed both hands in her lap and looked straight ahead. That was trust, the kind of trust that is worth more, in the end, than any deed or contract or line item in any wedding budget. I did not start the engine immediately. I took my phone out one final time. There was one remaining thing that needed to be said, and I wanted to say it clearly. I drafted a message to the event manager, concise, professional, confirming that the final payment was being withheld pending a review of the evening's conduct toward a family member. I included a single line noting that I had documentation I was prepared to share if required. I sent it and put the phone face down. My phone began to vibrate almost immediately, not from the event manager, from Marcus, once, then again, then 3 times quickly, each call pressing with a kind of urgency I hadn't heard from him since he was in his 20s. And something in his life had gone wrong. I let the calls run. I pulled the car to the side of the estate lane and shut off the engine. Ruth opened her eyes and looked at me. I showed her the screen. She looked at his name for a moment, and then looked at me and gave the smallest, quietest nod I have ever seen. That nod was all I needed, I answered. Marcus's voice came through fast and tight. He wanted to know what was happening with the event manager. He wanted to know about the cancellations. There was something in his voice I had not expected, not anger, exactly. Closer to panic, the sound of someone whose plan has suddenly lost its foundation. I waited until he finished. Then I said, in the calmest voice I could manage, "We're in the parking lot. If you want to talk, come out here." Fewer than 5 minutes later, I saw them crossing the main lawn toward us. Marcus walked ahead, moving quickly. Diana followed, her dress no longer lifted with the careful attention she had given it earlier in the evening. The estate lights behind them caught the live oak branches in long shadows across the gravel. It looked like a scene from something. I thought, briefly, that if I were a different kind of person I might appreciate the drama of it. Diana reached us first. She spoke before Marcus could collect himself. Her voice was higher than usual, not anger, but fear wearing anger's face. She talked about the guests, about professional contacts in the room, about the embarrassment this was causing, about the deposits already spent. Her words came quickly, practiced, the kind of speech prepared by someone who has always been able to talk their way back to solid ground. I let her finish. Marcus stood slightly behind her, looking first at me, then at Ruth. He did not know where to stand. I watched his face move through several expressions and settle into something I could only describe as a man who has run his calculation and found, for the first time, that the numbers don't favor any available option. That stillness in him no longer softened me the way it once had. I did not argue. I did not walk through every phone call. I said only that I had stopped what was in my name, and that certain limits had been passed long before tonight, and that tonight was simply when they became visible. Diana said I was overreacting. She said it was a misunderstanding. She said Ruth had volunteered. I looked at Ruth. Ruth said nothing. She stood straight, both hands on her cane, and her silence was more complete and more devastating than anything she could have said. I reached into the car and took out the envelope I had placed in the glove compartment 3 weeks earlier. A thick envelope, sealed, prepared with care. I did not wave it. I set it on the hood of the car with both hands, the way you set down something that has weight. I told Diana that before she finished her explanation of the misunderstanding, she might want to account for a few things I had quietly documented over the previous several months. I said I was aware of the items that had been removed from our home on Rutledge Avenue, specifically, a collection of sterling silver pieces that had belonged to Ruth's mother, a set of first-edition books from my father's shelf, 3 small items of jewelry that Ruth had listed once in a letter to Marcus as things she hoped to pass down someday. None of these things had monetary value that would register to someone accustomed to Manhattan real estate, but they had been sold. I had the receipts, I had the dates, I had the account information for where the money had gone, and I had reviewed the personal debt records that matched those dates. Diana went very still. It was the first time since I had known her that she had no answer ready. Marcus looked at the envelope. He looked at me. He looked away. I said I had no interest in excuses. The documentation was clear on its own. Dates, amounts, accounts, lined up against a pattern of personal debt that Diana had kept entirely separate from any finances Marcus and I had ever discussed. Diana said it had been temporary. She said she had planned to replace everything. I nodded. I said that some things, once they leave a house, do not come back, regardless of intention. That the intention changes nothing about what happened to Ruth's mother's silver. Then I turned to Marcus. I stopped talking about the envelope. I talked about his silence. The specific, repeated, calculated silence I had watched him maintain for nearly 2 years. The times he had been in the room when things were said about Ruth, about both of us, and had chosen to say nothing. I said I had spent 36 years believing I was raising a man with a clear sense of what was right and what was owed to people who love you. I said that tonight I had revised that belief. I did not say it with cruelty. I said it the way you report a finding clearly, accurately, without heat. He lowered his head. He did not respond. I told him the Manhattan apartment would be recovered under the clause he had signed. I said I was not doing it as punishment, though I understood it would feel that way. I said I was doing it because I had spent too long providing a foundation beneath him that made it possible for him never to feel the full weight of his choices. I said it was past time for that to change. Vanessa Diana reacted more strongly to this than anything else I had said. She said I was dismantling their future. She said it with genuine feeling. The most genuine I had heard from her all evening. I looked at her steadily. I said, a future is not dismantled by losing things that were never truly yours. It is only revealed for what it actually was. Ruth stepped forward then. Just one step. She said she was tired. She said she wanted to go home. Her voice was calm, not cold, not triumphant, simply finished. The calmness of a woman who has held a position for a very long time and is ready to set it down. That calmness made every argument pointless. I folded the envelope and put it back in the car. I said this conversation was ending here, not because I had nothing more to say, but because I refused to let this parking lot become another stage. I opened Ruth's door and helped her inside. As I closed it, I saw Marcus still standing on the gravel, caught between moving toward us and stepping back. Diana watched the car with an expression I had never seen on her before, stripped of its confidence, uncertain what came next. I started the engine. This time, I did not stop. As we drove down the estate lane and through the main gate, I watched the lights of Beaumont Estate recede in the mirror. The live oaks, the candlelit windows, the $140,000 of camellias and heart pine and imported wine, all of it growing smaller and then disappearing around a curve in the road. I felt no victory. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I did not feel righteous or powerful or relieved. I felt the specific, sobering sensation of a very old order finally giving way and a new one, not yet fully formed, beginning to take its shape in the dark. We did not talk much on the drive out of the low country that night. Ruth rested her head against the window and let the landscape move past her. The streetlights grew further apart. The salt marshes opened up on either side of the highway, flat and silver under a partial moon. I let the silence be what it was. Some things settle better in quiet. That night we stopped at a small motel outside Walterboro. Nothing remarkable about it. No one knew who we were. Ruth said she felt lighter than she had in months. I did not ask her to explain it further. Some feelings are reduced rather than clarified by too many words. Over the next 2 weeks we moved slowly. No plan, no destination. Ruth had always wanted to see the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and we had never gone. We went. We drove up through the barrier islands in the early mornings, when the light was low and the beaches were empty. We ate at the kind of places that don't have websites. We called no one. No one we needed to call. Eventually, on a morning when the weather had turned particularly clean and clear, we stopped in a small coastal town north of Beaufort. Ruth looked out the car window at the marsh grass bending in the wind off the water, and said she liked the feeling of the air there. I turned off the main road and found a rental by the water, a simple wooden house with a porch facing east. We stayed a week. Then we stayed another. Then I called the owner and asked about a longer arrangement. We began to live again at a pace that had been owed to us for years. Every morning I made coffee and brought it to the porch before Ruth woke up. She would come out in her robe, her hair still loose, and we would watch the marsh birds moving through the cordgrass without saying anything much. Her knee was improving with the walking. My back was improving with the absence of whatever it is that makes backs tighten in a life organized around obligation. I set up a small scholarship through a community foundation in the area for students pursuing engineering or construction management. No plaques, no naming rights, no announcement. Just a thing I had always meant to do and had always deferred. Ruth sat with me at the kitchen table while I filled in the paperwork, and she said it made her feel that the money had gone somewhere real. Marcus called. At first regularly, then with longer gaps between calls. I did not answer immediately. Not as a punishment, as a space in which both of us could face what had happened without the habit of the old relationship collapsing back into place before we had actually dealt with anything. One afternoon I answered. The conversation was short. There were long pauses. He said things were harder than he had expected. I said I knew. I did not ask in what specific ways. I did not offer solutions. I said only that when he was ready to talk as two adults who were genuinely trying to understand what had happened, I was willing to do that. Not before. Not in the old way. Diana never called. I waited for a few weeks in case she did. Then I stopped waiting. Some relationships end without a final scene. They simply stop when the thing they were built on runs out. One evening, Ruth and I sat on the porch as the sun went down over the marsh. The sky turned the color of copper and then of rose and then of something I don't have a word for. Ruth was holding my hand, her thumb moving slowly over my knuckles the way it has for 34 years. She said she had stopped thinking about the blue dress, that it no longer came to her when she was trying to sleep. I told her I had stopped thinking about the bucket and the rubber gloves, that they had settled into a place in my memory where they no longer had weight in the present. That was true, and it surprised me, the first time I felt it. I picked up my phone from the arm of the porch chair. There were missed calls from Marcus. I looked at them for a moment. I did not delete them. I set the phone back down, face down. I thought about what I want to say to you now, to anyone watching this who is a parent, or a spouse, or simply a person who has given and told themselves that this is what love requires. Here is what I know at 69 that I did not know at 50, or 40, or 35. Loyalty and silence are not the same thing. Staying at a table where you are being diminished is not patience, it is permission. And the people who are diminishing you will take that permission as evidence that they can go further. They will always go further. The only thing that stops it is the moment you stand up, not with cruelty, not with revenge, but with the plain, clear intention of someone who has decided that their dignity is not negotiable. The mistake most people make, and I say this having made it myself, is believing that standing up will cost you the relationship. Sometimes it does. But what I learned in that parking lot in the Low Country, what I learned in the weeks of quiet driving that followed, is that a relationship that can only survive when you remain small was never actually holding you. It was only holding what you were willing to give. If you are in that situation right now, the one thing I would tell you to do today, not tomorrow, today, is to identify one boundary you have stopped enforcing. Just one, the smallest one. Write it down if you have to, and then enforce it. See what happens. Not because you want conflict, but because you deserve to find out what remains when you stop accommodating everything. Ask yourself honestly, am I being generous? Or am I just afraid of what stays if I stop? That question changed my life at 69. I hope it reaches you sooner. The night settled in around us, slow and cool. Ruth leaned her head against my shoulder. I put my arm around her. We didn't need to say anything. This is what we had deferred for years in the name of keeping everyone else comfortable. This quiet, this porch, this light above the marsh. I don't believe in tidy endings. Real life at this age does not come with clean resolutions. Marcus and I are still finding our way towards something. What it will look like, I genuinely don't know. But for the first time in a long time, I am not managing the distance between us by removing the weight from his side of it. Whatever we build now, if we build anything, will be built on something real. And Ruth is sleeping through the night again. That for now is enough. Before I go, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below with the number that matches where you stand on this. Comment 1 if you think the decision made in that parking lot was the right one, and you would have done the same. Comment 2 if you think there was a path toward repair that was closed too quickly, and the family deserved more time. Comment 3 if you have been in a version of this situation yourself, whether as the parent, the spouse, or the child, and this story landed somewhere personal for you. And drop a comment right below this telling me your city and what time it is, where you are right now. I read all of them, every single one. It matters to me to know where this story finds people. If this reached you tonight, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Every share keeps these stories going slow, honest, and human. This story is a narrative inspired by real emotional experiences common to many families. It has been completely rewritten by me, from a new perspective, new location, new characters, and new details for the purpose of original storytelling. It is not a reproduction of any other work.